Thank you, Rabbi. Good to be back. By the way, in between last lecture and this one, I was at the Shapell's women's yeshiva for the first time. I think we're going to start comparing who asks better questions. I'm here for a few years. I'm used to you guys. But now let's see if the girls have better questions or you guys. So let's see, okay? This is the first time, I think, that the Yeshiva chose the topic. So thank you very much. Thank you. So the Yeshiva chose a topic, and it's a wonderful topic, a very interesting one and an important one about rabbis during the Holocaust, because rabbis is not just, first of all, it's leadership. Leadership in the Holocaust is in general an important topic, but this is spiritual leadership, religious leadership, people who historically the Jewish community have looked to for guidance. And here when we come to these very challenging and tragic times, so how does the religious leadership react to those times? How do they guide their communities? How do they set an example and role model? And I think this is a super important and fascinating topic, so I want to thank, first of all, the Yeshiva for choosing it, and let's dive right in. So I'll open up with a story in the Warsaw Ghetto, towards the end of the Warsaw Ghetto, where in 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto is the largest and most famous of all the ghettos. Warsaw is the center of Jewish life before the war. It's the largest Jewish community in Europe. It's the most prominent Jewish community in Europe. And the Warsaw Ghetto was established by the Nazis in November 1940. At its peak, it held nearly 500,000 Jews, dwarfing any other ghetto in Nazi-occupied Europe. Over the course of the next 2 years, until the summer of 1942, there was a lot of suffering in the ghetto. Nearly 100,000 Jews died in the ghetto just of the physical conditions. And then we come to the summer of 1942, where the Great Deportation takes place. The Nazis deport the Jews of Warsaw to the Treblinka death camp, where they are all exterminated. By the time the Great Deportation is over in September, so there's about 60,000 Jews left in the ghetto, after it had been at its peak nearly 500,000. And that lasts until about April 1943. In April 1943, the Nazis decide, okay, the time has come to deport the last Jews of Warsaw to the Treblinka death camp, to the gas chambers. And this is when the Jews of Warsaw realize the situation is hopeless and they're all going to be killed anyway. So the uprising breaks out as an attempt to either stop the deportation or at least slow it down, or whatever it was trying to do. The Nazis crushed the uprising and burned down the entire ghetto, building by building, block by block, and murder all the ghetto's inhabitants. That's the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. Why is that important for the background? You're about to see. Because during that last stage, right before April, in the lead up to the last deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto, when the Warsaw Ghetto is just a shadow of its former self, when the clock is ticking, when everyone knows the situation is helpless, and the uprising is being planned, and most were already gone, either by the gas chambers or even earlier by starvation and typhus, a non-Jewish Catholic priest, Chasidu Motolam, righteous among the nations, decided that he wants to help and save Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, with all good intentions, he can't save tens of thousands of Jews. He could only save a couple. So how is he going to choose which Jews to save in the ghetto? So he thinks to himself, well, I'm a man of religion, I'm a clergyman, so maybe I'll find rabbis, fellow clergy, and I'll rescue them and hide them and risk my life to keep them in my apartment on the other side of Warsaw and save their lives. So he smuggles himself into the ghetto, and he asks through, surreptitiously, does things, he can't have people find out, are there any rabbis left in the ghetto? I want to meet with them and make them an offer to save their lives. Okay? And he he succeeds in doing so. They come to the offices of the Judenrat, of the Jewish leadership in the ghetto, and he meets with, it was 3 rabbis, as far as my understanding. It could be there are others there. The names of 3 rabbis have come down. Now, most rabbis in the Warsaw Ghetto are already gone at this point. They had been killed in the gas chambers of Treblinka. There were some rabbis still alive, and 3 of them who were members of the official formal Warsaw Rabbinate, in other words, not rabbis who happened to live in Warsaw, but they were part of the official Warsaw Rabbinate, who are still alive. One was a very famous individual, Rabbi Menachem Zemba, who was probably one of the most famous rabbis in Poland before the war. He was a Ger Chassid. He was one of the Gdolei Hadar, one of the greatest and most famous rabbis around, wrote many Sfarim. He was the head of the Bezdin in Warsaw, and he was the head of one of the Warsaw yeshivas. He was world-renowned, Rabbi Menachem Zemba. So he was probably the greatest living rabbi in Warsaw at this time. He's one of them. There was also Reb David Kahana and Reb Shimshon Stockhammer. 3 rabbis. Okay. So the Polish priest, he's able to save 3 people. That's not a big deal. I mean, it's still a big deal. He's still risking his life, and it's still taking on a lot, but this he's willing to do. So he meets with them, and he presents his offer to them. And they're shocked. They're taken aback. Like, wow, you're risking your life for this to save us. We're total strangers. Like, this is incredible. We need to discuss this offer, confer amongst ourselves. And they go to the next room, come back a few minutes later, and they say again, thank you so much for this offer. It's unbelievable how much you're willing to risk your life, but we're going to turn it down. Turn it down? What does that even mean? Why would you be turning this down? And he says, because we discussed it, and we came to the conclusion that we're the rabbis of the Warsaw Jewish community. And if we're the rabbis of the Warsaw Jewish community, then we don't leave behind our community to get saved for ourselves while they get left behind. And the priest says, rabbis, with all due respect, there is no Warsaw Jewish community left to speak of. The Warsaw Jewish community is for the most part already in the gas chambers at Treblinka. The rest are starved, slave labor, with SS guards, and the clock is ticking. Who knows when they're going to renew deportations? It's just a matter of time. So right now you're just being held by the SS to extract some slave labor for another couple of months, and then they're going to take you to the gas chambers. There is no Warsaw Jewish community. There is no need for rabbis, and there is no position of rabbi and community. That whole structure is gone. What do you mean you can't leave? And Rabbi Menachem Zemba, who was the spokesman of the group, started to cry. And he says, you're absolutely right. There is no longer any Warsaw Jewish community, and there's no more communal rabbinate. And there is absolutely nothing we can do for our community, except for one thing. Be here. That's the only thing we can still do for our community, is to be here with them. And if that's the only thing we have left, then we're not going to take it away from them. That's the leadership of the community that we still have, and therefore we're not going to do it. We're not going to leave it. Reb Shimshon Stockhammer was killed in the Holocaust. Rabbi Menachem Zemba was killed in the Holocaust. Reb David Kahana somehow miraculously survived. Good thing he did, because that's how we know the story. And that was the end of the Warsaw Rabbinate. So what was that position? What type of message were they sending to us, to the Jewish community? Is that the rabbi leadership is not a technical thing, that if I have a question about a milchik fork falling into a fleishik pot, and I'm not sure if it's kosher, the rabbi is more knowledgeable in Shulchan Aruch and halacha than I am, so I ask the rabbi. That's what a rabbi is for, right? If I have problems with my chinuch in my home, I'm not sure how to guide my children on the right path and teaching them Torah and mitzvahs. So the rabbi is a wise person in Jewish matters. I'm going to go consult with the rabbi about chinuch in my home. That's what the rabbi is for. It's all these technical things in religious life. This story is telling us that there's something way beyond that. That the religious leadership is a almost fatherly leadership, that the rabbi remains with the community. The rabbi's there, and he stays there under all circumstances, because he'll never abandon his community. He'll be there for them, even when when he can't even do anything. He can't save them, he can't help them, and I promise you at this point no one was coming with questions about a milchik fork and a fleishik pot. But they wanted to at least be there with them. And what happens is that this is one model of leadership that I want to speak about. One model of leadership that I want to speak about, that we see over and over again, of rabbis providing leadership not in actually doing something, but just being there. If we move over to Germany, there was a very prominent rabbi. He was a rabbi of Hamburg, the last chief rabbi of Hamburg, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Karlbach. More correctly, Rabbi Dr. Yosef Tzvi Karlbach. Very orthodox rabbi. But in Germany, orthodox rabbis are very often rabbi doctors. Because in German orthodoxy, following the philosophy developed in the 19th century by Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch of Torah and Derech Eretz, so many of the members of the German Orthodox rabbinate were elite in their orthodoxy, very, very big Talmidei Chachamim, but also university educated and with doctorates. And it wasn't a contradiction in Germany at that time. And Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Karlbach was a perfect example of that, a perfect expression of that, because Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Karlbach was Yosef Karlbach was one of the heads of Agudas Yisrael, which was the Orthodox political organization across Europe. He was a respected Paisik in Halacha. He wrote some Sfarim, and at the same time, he was very German in his mannerisms and his culture and his education. And he is appointed as the chief rabbi of Hamburg. By the way, I didn't just read about his stories in books. My wife's grandmother grew up in Hamburg before their family escaped from the Nazis in the late 1930s, and she remembered him. She remembered Rabbi Tzvi Karlbach personally. She remembers him as a person. So it was she used to talk about him. So it's something that was a real person who lived among us. And in the 1930s in Germany, this is way before the final solution. This is the Nazi government, the German government, the new Nazi government of Adolf Hitler, that rose to power in Germany, and there's all these anti-Jewish legislation and removing Jews from society, and these are warning signs to German Jewry, and actually German Jewry was in a bit of a paradox. They were the luckiest ones, because they had 6 years of warning about how bad Nazism is, and how horrible it is to live under the Nazi regime, to be able to leave and escape way before the war started, way before the final solution begins, and the mass murder of Jews begins many years later. So many German Jews availed themselves of this opportunity, if there was any country that was willing to accept them, and they tried to emigrate from Germany. So, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Karlbach had this opportunity to leave. And he had an opportunity to emigrate. And many Jews in Hamburg were leaving. It seemed like everyone was just trying to get out. This is the 1930s. Before the war begins. And he declined. He decided not to leave. And he said, like a real German Rav, real Yeki, he said, my contract, I was appointed as the chief rabbi of the Hamburg Jewish community. So that means as long as there's a Jewish community in Hamburg, then I am the rabbi. If there's no Jewish community in Hamburg, if every single Jew, I think he even said, I'm not sure, I have to double check this, I think he said, if there's a minion of Jews in Hamburg, then I'm staying. Because that means there's still a Hamburg Jewish community. And I can't leave. I'm the rabbi of the community. They come first. The community comes first, not my personal safety. And if there's none, if there's 0 Jews in Hamburg, okay, so then I can leave. But I'll turn the lights off before I leave. But if there is still around, there's still Jews in Hamburg, then I'm not leaving. And he didn't. And he stayed. In 1941, some of his kids were able to get out. Not all, unfortunately. But in 1941, he, his wife, and whichever of his kids were not able to leave, they were deported east to Riga with the last Jews of Hamburg who weren't able to get out. And they were shot in the Rumbala forest by the German SS and their local Latvian collaborators and were killed. And Rebbe Karlbach lived till the end of his life as the chief rabbi of Hamburg, unwilling to abandon his community, with again that message of leadership. It's interesting, the Panovizher Rav, Rabbi Yosef Shlomo Kahaneman, was the legendary figure. He was on a fundraising trip. He was fundraising his whole life, and ultimately that saved his life. He was on a fundraising trip when the war broke out, and he and his son were out fundraising, and he wasn't able to get back. The war broke out. His wife and his children were killed. His community was wiped out. Panovich, his yeshiva students, all of them were killed. But he and his son survived because they were out fundraising. So he spent the rest of his life rebuilding. He came here and he rebuilt yeshivas and schools and institutions and endlessly fundraising and building. There's plenty to speak about the Panovich Rav. But there's one thing that he said that really struck me. He said that he was a rabbi in Lithuania before the war, and the rabbis had a rabbinical organization called the Agudas HaRabbanim of Lithuania, of Lita. And in the Agudas HaRabbanim of Lita, anyone who was the rabbi of a town, it could be a small little tiny shtetl, it could be a big city, maybe it's just a little neighborhood in a big city, maybe it's a mid-sized town, all kinds of rabbis, right? And they're all members of this Agudas HaRabbanim. And he said there was 140 something, I remember the exact, 145, 140 something members of this Agudas HaRabbanim de Lita before the war. And he says, I am the only one alive today. The only one in the entire country, because he happened to be on a fundraising trip. That means every single Lithuanian rabbi in the entire country stayed with their community. Many of them probably had no choice, but some of them had escape routes. Some of them were prominent figures and were well known, and they were able to get them out. No one, not a single one left. It's incredible. An entire world of the rabbinate. Some of them are very famous. Some of them would have been very famous had they continued to live, had they developed. Many of them were young rabbis. And they didn't coordinate this strategy, right? It wasn't like they had a meeting of the whole Agudas HaRabbanim once the Nazis came in and said, hey, I think this should be the official policy of the rabbinate. Each and every one decided on their own. They didn't have a WhatsApp group of rabbis of Lita. And they said, okay guys, official party line is we all stay with our communities. That's not what happened. Rabbis would never have, WhatsApp and smartphones, right? So that they didn't have this. So what is that each and every one came to this decision on their own. Each and every one. They all decided this is the right thing to do. This is what we do. We don't abandon our community. If we have to die with our community, if we have to get killed with our community, then that's what must be done. That's what we'll have to do. So that was a saying of the Panovich Rav. It's interesting, in Poland, there's some of the great Hasidic leaders, Rabbis. Big Rabbis were considered big celebrities. And some of them had Hasidim all over the world. Hasidim who had immigrated to the United States, to England, to places far from Nazi occupation. Some of these Hasidim made a lot of money and were willing to bribe officials or procure documents or immigration certificates for the great Rebbe. And there was this vision that if we save the Rebbe, then we can rebuild after the war. Which happened. Some Rebbes did escape. They didn't abandon their communities. Their Hasidim said, you have to leave because we need to save the Rebbe and we need to be able to rebuild through the Rebbe after the war. The tzaddik, the leader, right? And some of them did escape, but most of them did not, even if they had the ability to. One of the biggest and most famous Rebbes before the war in Poland was the Radomska Rebbe, the Radomsk Hasidus, which was completely annihilated. No one even heard of it today. Radomska, whoever heard of Radomsk? Radomsk was huge. Tens of thousands of Hasidim across Poland. A network of yeshivas called the Keser Torah Yeshiva Network that had over 3,000 Talmidim. That means just the Radomsk yeshivas had 3,000 Talmidim in their yeshivas across Poland. And Reb Shlomo Henech Rabinovich was the Radomsker Rebbe, and he had a group of Hasidim in London who were able to work out an exit for him to get to Italy, and from there to England through the Mediterranean, and they had the documents, and they had the people paid off, and everything was worked out. And when they received it and presented it to him to smuggle him out of, first he was in Sosnovich, and then he escaped to Warsaw, and they said, you can get it, let's go. They didn't even give him the option. They said, we're going. And he did not let them. They tried dragging him out of Poland, and he said, no, I'm staying. He even said the pasuk in Navi, B'seich ami ani yesheves. I sit among my people. But you're not among your people. You're the Rebbe. You're special. We have to rescue you. You have Hasidim in England too. You have Hasidim in America. You have a responsibility to rebuild. He said, no, but I'm here. I'm here with my Hasidim. I'm not leaving them behind. B'seich ami ani yesheves. What happens to the Radomsker Rebbe? During the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto, he's being dragged out of his home, and he's shot in the streets of Warsaw. He didn't even make it to the gas chambers in Treblinka. He was shot on the street by the SS, and he's buried in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. We go to his kever when we bring groups there, and he was probably the last burial there, because it was during the Great Deportation, and he did not even make it to the trains. Similarly, the Alexander Rebbe, the Yitzchak Danziger. Yitzchak Danziger was again, Alexander Hasidus was the largest in the world after Ger. Ger was the biggest, still are one of the biggest. But the Alexander Rebbe, also early on in the war, had this opportunity to escape, decided to stay, is killed in the gas chambers of Treblinka. And there's many others. There's so many other examples of this. In fact, the Alexander Rebbe tried to inspire his Hasidim while he was with them in the Warsaw Ghetto. Later on, while he's with them going into the same gas chambers in Treblinka like they were. He told his Hasidim, he said, we say in the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur davening, U'tshuva u'tefila u'tzedakah ma'avirin esraya ha'gezerah. Tshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah, they take care of us in times of crisis. And he said in the Machzor, if you look in the Machzor, there's little words on top of Teshuva, Tefillah, Tzedakah. On top of the word Tshuva, it says Koil, voice, crying out. On top of the word, that's by Tefillah, by Tshuva, it says Tzoim, fasting. By Tefillah, it says Koil, sound of tefillah, koil Yaakov, and tzedakah, it says mamain, money, helping poor people, right? So he said here in the Warsaw Ghetto, we don't have any mamain, we can't do the tzedakah, we don't have anything. We can't share with others because we don't have even for ourselves. He says we also don't have tzoim, we don't have fasting. You know why? Because the fasting isn't our choice. We're fasting because there's nothing to eat. So that's not a real fast. Fast is when I have and I choose to fast. So that means the only thing we have left is koil, that we can daven and cry out to Hashem. So you might be disheartened by that, he said to his Hasidim. That all you have is koil. In order to do it, ma'avir nisrei gzeira, the only way to get rid of the evil decree is if we have all three. If we only got one, what's it worth? So he said a beautiful thing. He said, there's a pasuk in Shir Hashirim. The pasuk in Shir Hashirim says, Ki koilech arev. Your voice is pleasant. Arev means pleasant, pretty. He said, but arev can also mean arevus, that it's a collateral. There is an arvus. Kol Yisrael arevim zelazeh. We're all responsible for each other. So there's this arvus. There's this, it's held as a collateral for something else. So he said, Ki koilech arev. The koil is an arev for the other two. When you don't have tzoim and you don't have mammon, the koil is the arev, and the koil is enough. You're good, you're covered, as long as you keep on crying out to Hashem. So that's how he inspired his Hasidim. He said, I'm not leaving, I'm staying with them till the bitter end, no matter what happens. And other story, interesting. The Karliner Rebbe, Rav Ram Elimelech Perlov, the Karliner Hasidim, the Karliner Rebbe's tzaddikim for probably 150 years were encouraging Hasidim to settle in Eretz Yisrael. Tzfas, Tveria, Yerushalayim. They had a strong community here. And Rav Ram Elimelech Perlov, the Karliner Rebbe, came to visit them. And when he came to visit them? In the summer of 1939. When did the war break out? It's September 1939. There's pictures of him here in the summer of 1939. And he's among his Hasidim. But his place of residence and the majority of his Hasidim were in Karlin, in Poland. And they say, it was no secret, Hitler was being this aggressive, blistering propaganda towards Poland. In the weeks leading up to the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, the plans were pretty public. They were threatening Poland. The Polish army had mobilized. The German army had mobilized at the border. And war seemed to be breaking out any day. So he said, you know what, I'm going to have to cut my visit short to Yerushalayim and go back to Poland. They said, yeah, you mind? No, you're going to make your visit longer and stay here until things calm down. So he said, no, I need to make sure to get back in time so I could be back in Poland with my Hasidim if there's a war. He said, no, Rebbe, don't do that. That's a really bad idea. And they tried to keep him in Yerushalayim. So before we were speaking about rabbis who could have escaped, and their leadership was, we're not going to escape. Here, this is a whole different extreme. He was already outside. It's the summer of 1939. This is dominating world news. This is in every newspaper, every radio broadcast. War is breaking out any day. What does he say? Let me go back home now. This is a great time to be back home with my Hasidim because war is breaking out. The Hasidim in Yerushalayim tried to force him to stay. He went back. Now, you don't take a little flight back from Yerushalayim to Warsaw back in those days, right? He had to take a boat, so it took a few weeks. What happened during those few weeks? The war broke out. In other words, he's not in Poland yet. He was in Romania. He was on his way back. And the war broke out. So you say, okay, fine. Until now he was optimistic. The war's not going to break out. It's just rhetoric. Maybe it will break out, but another few months. Right? So he was being optimistic. Let me go back. He wanted to go back. Now the war did break out. You're in Romania. You're in a place that's not involved in the war. You're not in Poland yet. So stay in Romania, go back to Yerushalayim. He continues. Literally there's refugees crossing the Polish frontier into Romania at this time to escape the war. Poles, Jews, everyone. You want to get away from the war. There's one person, the Karliner Rebbe, he's going the opposite direction. Let's go right into the war. And he literally goes, after the war had already broken out, he goes back into Poland. And he goes back to be with the Hasidim. And he was killed in the Holocaust. Together with the Jews of Karlin, together with his Hasidim of Karlin, Ram Elimelech was killed by the Nazis. To them it was important. Now they didn't know if they would be killed or when they would be killed. There was no final solution at this point. The point was, they said, I have to be with my community. I can't abandon them. I have to be with them. That's leadership. That's responsibility. That's to be with. That's a Rebbe. That's a leader. The above and many, many, many more examples of that is one kind of rabbinical leadership, and that's the act of being with them during this time of crisis. There's many other types of leaderships as well, and that is not just to be with them, but what do you do? What does a leader do? What does a rabbi do? How does he act as a rabbi? Not just just for being with them. What type of rabbinical leadership do we have? Leadership under fire. So we have a classic example. The classic example is the Piasetzner Rebbe, Reb Kleinem Miskalma Shapiro, who was very famous before the war already. He was a very prominent Rebbe. Piasetzner is this little suburb of Warsaw, and after World War I, he basically permanently settled in Warsaw. He was living in the city already. He would go back to Piasetzner like for Yom Ne'Rayim, for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but he pretty much moved to Warsaw, and he became an educator. He said, my job now is to be a Rebbe. He opened the yeshiva, he gave a shir, a Gemara shir to Bachram. He became this mechanech. He wrote a sefer on chinuch chavis talmidim, and emerges. He's young, he's getting older. He's becoming one of the most famous Rebbes in the world, a great mechanech, a great Rebbe, a great tzaddik, world-renowned. And the war breaks out, and during the bombing of Warsaw, first weeks of the war, before the first German soldier enters Warsaw, they're bombing the city. Right? And it's an indiscriminate bombing. Many civilians are killed. They didn't drop leaflets to tell civilians to go out of the buildings. The Germans didn't do that. So many civilians, now Polish civilians, Jewish civilians, Jews were a third of the Warsaw City population. The Piasetzner Rebbe's son and daughter-in-law are killed in the bombings. His wife had passed away young. She was already gone a few years before the war. So before the war, like a month into the war, the Piasetzner Rebbe is ready, alone, just with one daughter left. That one daughter ended up in Treblinka 2 years later. But that's it. And he starts to mourn his misfortune, this is what happened, just the beginning of the war. And yet, with all his years of being a Rebbe and being a Rosh Hashiva and thousands of Talmidim and writing Sfarim, the Piasetzner Rebbe's career is just getting started, because his greatest glory comes in the Warsaw Ghetto. What does he start to do in the Warsaw Ghetto? He starts to give Shalosh Udas Shmuzin, a tish. Tish. First of all, without Shirayim, what type of tish is that, right? There's no food. How could it be a Hasidic tish without food? And the tish is telling Torah, just relating Hasidus, telling the Hasidim, and inspiring them during this challenging time, trying to help them during this challenging time, harsh time. And people come to listen to the Piasetzner Rebbe. And Shabbos afternoon, he's giving a shmooze, and he caters it to the time. He's not very abstract or, esoteric. He's talking to them about what they're going through. And he's giving them a message that they need to hear during this time. And he's giving them chizik, and he's talking about emunah, and he's talking, and you see, now he dated the shmuz. We'll get to how he wrote them and how we have them today in a second. But ultimately, when we receive them, we see how that he dated them. Now, when they're dated, you can trace his thought process, because we know what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto at that time. Right? So we know what he's addressing. And we see the message changing. In the beginning, he's talking a lot about hope and being optimistic for a better future. Because in the beginning, it was possible to do that. And then you see him change. And he talks about emunah. And no hope, because everyone had lost hope. And he's not going to be someone standing there, even though it's bad, be hopeful. Because he's talking to the people who are going through real challenges. And if it's impossible to have hope anymore, then he's going to speak about something else. And what does he speak about? Emunah. He speaks about Golus. He speaks about suffering. He speaks about a relationship with Hashem even when we don't understand Him. He speaks about what is there's individuals and then there's a Klal Yisrael, that sometimes Klal Yisrael can survive even if individuals don't. And he goes through these stages, and they're incredible, and people are actually coming to listen to them. Now eventually, he's convinced, he writes that, after Shabbos he writes down these shmuzin in his own handwriting. And he's convinced to deposit his writings with the Ringelblum archive, the Yonik Shabbos archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, which I spoke about here once. Very famous archive. A historian, Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum, organized this archive, and he had a Hasidic rabbi, Reb Shimon Huberband, who was his liaison, who was Ringelblum's liaison to the religious community. Ringelblum wasn't religious, but he was a big secularist, but his philosophy of the archive was all Jews are important, and all Jews, their story needs to be told, so we need to hear every type of voice in this archive. So Reb Shimon Huberband was in charge of gathering material on the religious community. And Reb Shimon Huberband goes to the Piasetzner Rebbe and says, your shmuzin, our history, this is what a Rebbe, what is Chassidus of the Baal Shem Tov starts in 200 years before in the 1700s in Ukraine. And the Baal Shem Tov taught a new derech of Avodas Hashem. What is a Rebbe leading and guiding Chassidim and teaching Chassidus? What does he do in a situation of the Holocaust? What does Chassidus have to offer? What does a Rebbe have to offer? What type of messages? Klal Yisrael needs to know that. The Jewish people need to remember this message forever. And we need your writings. And he donates the writings to the Ringelblum archive. Now, before that, he edits them. And the edits come a year later. And when researchers examine the original writings, which exist till today, because they're found in the archive, of the Piasetzner Rebbe, we can see his edits. In other words, we see how his mind changed based on even more recent developments a year later, when he's editing it before he gives it into the archive. For instance, and this is not what he's telling the public in the Shalosh Shmuz, this is his own edits that he's writing in before he deposits it in the archive. In other words, the recipients of that message are not the Hasidim in the Warsaw Ghetto, but who are they? Us! Because we're the ones who read it from the archive. And in one place, there's this whole Shalosh Shmuz that he writes about how there's this continuity throughout the exile, throughout Golus, of 2,000 years of history, of suffering. That it all comes from Churban Beis HaMikdash. And because we need to do tshuva, and come back to Hashem, and be better, and therefore we always need to improve, and therefore there's this suffering of Jews throughout the exile, and he traces it, the Churban Beis HaMikdash, and then there's, all these steps along the way, and the crusades, and pogroms, and expulsions, and all kinds of things, and he says, and this is just the latest one in this continuity of Jewish suffering, and it's all in this big context. That's what he said in the original Shmuz. And the original Shmuz was before the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto, when it was just suffering in the ghetto. A year later, he's editing it. And in between had been the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto that they now knew were straight to the gas chambers of Treblinka, taking the largest Jewish community in Europe and putting them all in over the course of one summer into gas chambers, killing them all, men, women, and children. And the edit, he writes, Kol zeh amarti, he says, all this I said before the events of last summer. Now that we had the events of last summer, I was wrong. This is not part of the continuity of what we've been suffering throughout the exile. This is something unique and different that we've never experienced and nothing has prepared us for. This is something completely different. So it's in its own category and it has to be understood in its own category. That's what the Piasetzner Rebbe is writing and modifying his view in real time. But that's not the best part about this edit, because we're talking about rabbinical leadership. That's the topic, right? There's a great researcher, a religious guy, right now, Dr. Daniel Reiser, and he did this careful, he nitpicked the original writing, meaning a lot. They found the Eish Kodesh after the war in the Ringo Bloom archive. They did like a microfilm, 1950s, right? This is primitive technology. They did a microfilm version and sent the rolls of microfilm to Israel, where Talmidim of the Piasetzner Rebbe read it and published it, and they gave it a name. The Talmidim of the Piasetzner Rebbe gave it a name. What's the name of the sefer? Anyone know? Eish Kodesh, they called it. Now, Eish Kodesh is the name that Talmidim of Piasetzner Rebbe in Tel Aviv in the 1950s gave to the sefer. That's not what the Piasetzner Rebbe called it. Piasetzner Rebbe gave it a different name. They just didn't like it, so they didn't use it. The Piasetzner Rebbe said he called it Drashos Mishnais Haza'am. Speeches, drushes, Mishnais Haza'am, from the years of terror, from the years of horror. Right? I'm not sure how to translate Za'am, but you get the idea. That's what he called it. So Daniel Reiser decided that, we're relying for 80 years on these microfilm things. He also discovered that they censored out all kinds of things from the microfilm that they didn't like, and some of the microfilm primitive technology had cut off pages at certain points. So the original version of Eish Kodesh is very much missing. So he went back to the writings of the Piasetzner Rebbe, which are in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and he sat over it for 2 years, and he put out a 2-volume work a couple of years ago, Drashos Mishnais Hazam. He gave it the original title, and that is and he didn't do anything. You say, if some academic, he probably added his own commentary. He didn't. He wrote a couple of footnotes. But the text is just the exact words of Piasetzner Rebbe. Just this time, it's not edited, and it's his exact wording. Now, I spoke to him, and he gave us some lectures. I heard this from him. He said his craziest discovery when he did this was that he found at sometimes the editing wasn't just adding something on the side. Sometimes he crossed things out. And then he got curious. Why a year later would he cross things out? So then he needed to use special technology because he crossed it out, you can't read it. But if you have ways to do it today that you can figure out under the layers of ink, and he was able to read what he crossed out, right? So he found that one of the things he crossed out is that he added like a letter to the finder of this, basically who would ever find the archive, to publish it and to whatever, what to do with it, like a kind of like directions, what to do. And the Piasetzner Rebbe signed that letter, his name. Now, when Rebbes sign their name, it's usually this whole like very flowery signing, and he ends off with his titles. The Admor and Piasetzner, whatever. And he crossed out Admor me Piasetzner. He crossed out that he's the Piasetzner Rebbe in the edits a year later, because he decided that a Rebbe is only a Rebbe if he has Hasidim and if he's able to give over. He's able to teach. He's able to share and inspire others to serve Hashem. But if his Hasidim are all dead and they're all in the gas chambers and there's nothing for the Rebbe to give over, then I have no right to call myself the Rebbe. A Rebbe is only someone who can share with others. And he's not a Rebbe, and he renounced his Rebbe title. Now we still call him the Piasetzner Rebbe. Why? Because we're learning his Torah, so we made him Rebbe again. Right? We made him Rebbe again. We're able to call him the Rebbe. But he felt at the end of his life, I'm not the Piasetzner. He resigned the title. He crossed it out. Amazing thing. Less famous, he's the most famous one of that. But I found a Litvische version of the Piasetzner Rebbe. Rabbi Avram Grodzinski was the Mashgiach of Slobodka Yeshiva. Avram Grodzinski was probably the closest Talmud of the Alter of Slobodka, of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, and he remained after a large contingent of the yeshiva moved to Hebron in 1924. He remained in Slobodka and oversaw that branch in Lithuania that stayed in Slobodka. he publishes the shmuzin, the Musar shmuzin of his Rebbe, the Alter of Slobodka, or Hatzafon, and he becomes the mashgiach of the Slobodka yeshiva. For many years, he's running the yeshiva because the Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka, who was the Alter of Slobodka's son-in-law, Rabbi Isaac Sher, he was mostly on the road fundraising. By the way, he was fundraising when the war broke out, and he also survived that way. He ended up here, and he opened the Slobodka Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. That's a different story. Ram Grodzinski was on the grounds. He was there with the Talmidim. And Ram Grodzinski's wife passed away young, and he raised his 8 children himself. So here you have an interesting situation. The Rosh Yeshiva is away fundraising, so you're running the day-to-day operations of the yeshiva. You're also the mashgiach and giving shmuzin and vadim and meeting personally with the 300 talmidim of the yeshiva. He's publishing the shmuzin of the Alter of Slobodka, and he's also the father and mother raising his 8 children. I don't even know how he had time to do all that. And he somehow did it. For years. The war breaks out. He's in the Kovna ghetto. And you know what he does? Shabbos afternoon, but in Lita we don't do Tishin and Chassidus, Musar Vadim. Musar, he has these, and I mean Musar Vadim are like intense meetings. They maybe they were talking about Holocaust stuff, like sharing the little food you have with other. No. They were talking about regular working on your midas, like in Musar Vadim before the war. Anger, jealousy, patience, regular Musar midas. And every week they would discuss a midah, and they would learn the sources related to it together. Now some of these members of this Vad survived the war. Amatul Zuckerman lived right here in Givat Shaul, 5 minutes from here, until 20-something years ago. I remember him. And he survived. He used to talk about what they talked about in the Musar Vadim. And he said at the end of every Musar Vad, they would all make Kabbalahs. They would all accept upon themselves how to work on the Musar for that week. So let's say it was anger. Now, I just want to remind you, the Kovna ghetto, they're starving, there's no food, they're under slave labor by the Nazis, and in the Kovna ghetto, the shootings, the killings had taken place right away. They were shot in the 9th fort. There were deportations from the Kovna ghetto to right nearby, right outside the city, to a place called the 9th Fort, where 30,000 Jews from Kovna and its environs were shot and killed by the Nazis and the Lithuanian collaborators over the course of the war. That means the average person participating in this Vad was starving, worked in slave labor most of the week, had family members, friends and neighbors who were already shot and killed at the 9th Fort, and didn't know when his turn would be because the Nazis are going to do another roundup and kill them at the 9th Fort. And he's going Shabbos afternoon to a Musar Vad by the Slobodka Mashgiach, and they're working on midas, on different ethical attributes to become better Yidden, better people, and then they make a Kabbalah, let's work on this week, and then throughout the week, when you're worried about getting killed and thinking about your friends and relatives who were killed, and being starved, and slave labor, you're also working on your anger, and your patience, and your jealousy, and your whatever other midah they're working on. It blows the mind. And Shmuel Deitch, another survivor, lives in Hadera, I think he's still alive even, he said he used to participate in this Vad, and he said, this kept us alive. And he said, when I think about that image of Ram Grodzinski, he said, this is to me the symbol of what Rabbanim did for us in the Kovna ghetto. They showed us that we're still human beings. We're still Jews. We still have a job in this world. We're not just animals of the Nazis. We're not just slaves of the Nazis that are just waiting for our turn to be killed. No! We remember who we are. And he says, doesn't matter what we're going through. We are still going to behave the way we're supposed to behave. We are still going to be who we're supposed to be. And that's what the Rabbanim gave them. It gave them this gift of humanity, of being able to, and that's what kept them going. Ram Grodzinski himself, during the liquidation of the ghetto, 4 of his children, out of the 8, 4 of his children were killed in the Holocaust. 4 of them managed to survive. 3 daughters and a son. The last of the 4, the son, the youngest, just died a couple of years ago in Bnei Brak. Reb Itchik Grodzinski. I met him a few times. Reb Shlomo Wolbe, did anyone hear of him? Big mashgiach. His wife was one of those 4 daughters. She survived the Kovna ghetto, and he was in the Kovna ghetto when it was being liquidated. He survived almost to the end of the war, and during the liquidation of the Kovna ghetto, which took place over a course of a few weeks, he broke his leg. He's an older man. By the way, there's a picture of him in the Kovna ghetto with his beard shaved by the Nazis. So this great mashgiach, he doesn't look like a mashgiach. I just want to remind you the picture, just to visualize it. He doesn't look like a mashgiach. The picture of him shows a yellow star on his shirt, like everyone else, an emaciated figure, and a completely shaved person. And this is the grace of mashgiach giving shmuzin on Shabbos afternoon. Okay? He breaks his leg during the liquidation of the ghetto. He's brought to the Jewish hospital. At a later stage of the liquidation of the ghetto, the Nazis are liquidating the ghetto. They don't need a Jewish hospital anymore. So they surround the hospital with snipers, and then they burn the hospital to the ground. The doctors, nurses, and all patients inside it were burnt alive, including Rabbi Avram Grudzinski. And that's how he was killed. There was another tzaddik named the Koishlikov Rov. That wasn't his real name. He was just a rabbi in Koishlikov, so they called him the Koishlikov Rov. His name was Tzvi Aryeh Frommer. He was a Sachachaver Chassid, and he was one of the biggest Ga'ainim in Europe, one of the biggest tzaddikim and Talmid Chacham, and he was a Rav in several towns, including Koishlikov, and he had a yeshiva in Sosnovich for a while. He was a very close Talmud of the Avnei Nezer of Sachachav, the first Sachachaver Rebbe, and he was known as one of the biggest Talmidei Chacham in Poland. And when Reb Meir Shapiro of the very famous Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, the greatest yeshiva in pre-war Poland, the visionary yeshiva, the one who also started the Daf Yomi, Reb Meir Shapiro passed away very young. He was 46 years old, and it was very sudden. So the Koishlikov Rav, Reb Tzvi Aryeh Frommer, was chosen as his successor. He actually was the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin for a lot longer than Reb Meir Shapiro. And he's the Rosh Yeshiva when the war breaks out. The Nazis close down the yeshiva, and the yeshiva disperses, and he escapes to Warsaw. He's eventually in the Warsaw ghetto. And what does he do in the Warsaw ghetto? He organizes an underground yeshiva. In bunkers, under the ground, he tells these Hasidic Bachurim to join his yeshiva, and in several bunkers around the Warsaw ghetto, after days of working in slave labor, after days of starving and of typhus and of who knows what else was going on there in the ghetto, they come to learn. And he visits each bunker. And he comes and gives a shiur in each bunker as the Rosh Yeshiva. Because he's the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. We have a diary from the Warsaw ghetto that says that they visited one of these bunkers, and they end off the description, the whole description, and he ends off, Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin is alive and well in the Warsaw ghetto. Amazing thing. Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin is alive and well in these little bunkers that the Rosh Yeshiva is visiting and giving shiurim. And then he himself was able to get a job. There was a chassid named Avram Hendel who he owned a big leather shop. And he tried to get a lot of rabbis to work in the shop to save their lives. So he had an official job in the ghetto. So a lot of rabbis worked there. He got like a few hundred rabbis. He was able to get them jobs in this workshop. So the Koishlikov Rebbe worked there. He had to do slave labor too. He's not different. The Nazis didn't say, oh, Rosh Yeshiva don't have to do slave labor, right? So someone described, again, these are eyewitness descriptions because the Ringelblum archive preserved all these diaries. Someone described a scene that seems too surreal to believe that it's actually true. But it is. It's an eyewitness testimony. That they entered the Schultz shop. That's what it was called. Because the Nazi in charge of Avram Hendel's shop, his name was Schultz. So they went into the Schultz shop to pick up something as part of his work detail, whatever it was. And he said he saw this workbench where 3 people are sitting there working with the leather and the shoes and whatever it was. All of them with torn clothing and skinny and look starved. All 3 of them, obviously at this point, no beards. And he looks closer, and it was the Koishlikov Rav, the Rosh Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, Rav Menachem Zemba, the Warsaw rabbi who we started off with, and the Piasetzner Rebbe, who we just spoke about. And the three of them are talking while they're making shoes. And what are they talking about? They're learning Torah. The three, he said, look at these people. I mean, you can't destroy them. You can't break them. They're unbelievable. You're not a Rosh Hashiva anymore. You're not a Rebbe anymore. You're not a Rebbe anymore. You're a slave for the Nazis trying to stay alive for another day making shoes. And what are you doing? You say, and they don't look like Rebbes, right? They don't look like it. And this is what they're doing. During the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Kodesh L'Kavod Rav was arrested and discovered by the Nazis and deported to Majdanek, where he was directly sent to the gas chambers. The Majdanek camp is very small, so the Selektia, they're right near each other. He had a Talmud named something Marco, I forgot his first name, who was selected to survive in Majdanek. And he's outside the gas chambers with those who were chosen to go to the concentration camp when he heard from inside the gas chamber, because the Kodesh L'Kavod Rav had this booming voice. And as the gas chamber door is being closed and people are panicking, the Kodesh L'Kavod Rav speaks to all those around him, who I don't even know, now they're all undressed already at this point. Nazis forced them to take off their clothing before they went to the gas chamber. These are people who he might not even know. Maybe they're not even religious Jews. And he speaks to them. And he says, we're going to die al Kiddush Hashem, and we should all say the Shema Yisrael together. And he gives them and this Marco guy, when he's relating the story, he said, you know what I realized? That was the last shir of the Kodesh L'Kavod Rav. He gave shiurim to his Talmidim his whole life. Because a Rosh Hashiva gives shiurim. And the Kodesh L'Kavod Rav's last shir was how to die al Kiddush Hashem. He's teaching them. How does a Rosh Hashiva give a shir about how to die al Kiddush Hashem? And he's teaching them with himself. He's not telling you guys go ahead and do that, I'm going to escape, right? We're going in this together, this is how we do it. They want to knock us down, we're going to stand up. We're going to express our beliefs. They can never destroy us completely. I want to end off with, on a similar note, the Bayana Rebbe, Reb Moshe Friedman, who was the Bayana Rebbe in Krakow, was one of the most famous rabbis in pre-war Poland. He was a big speaker, and he was in the Me'atzis Gedolei HaTorah of Agudas Yisrael, was a prominent position, and he was involved in a lot of communal matters, thousands of Hasidim, and he ends up in Auschwitz, like many others, and he's standing there in Auschwitz. Now, in Auschwitz there was the Sonderkommando, the special task force, who had the worst job in human history, and they were forced to lead the Jews into the gas chambers. The Nazis didn't want to do the dirty work themselves. They forced Jews themselves to do it, and they lead them in, and then they have to take out the bodies and put them into the crematorium ovens. The worst of the worst. Almost no Sonderkommando members survived. There's a few who survived also. But some of these members of the Sonderkommando were very cognizant that they're witnesses to the greatest crime in human history. And they decided to record what they're seeing because they realized they wouldn't survive. And some of the members of the Sonderkommando wrote notes of what they're seeing and then buried those notes in little glass jars near the crematorium. They were found after the war. There's been books written based on these notes. I only recommend reading it if you don't plan on sleeping for a month or so. But some of them were found. And one of the ones who was found was by a fellow by the name of Leib Langfuss. Leib Langfuss was killed as a member of the Sonderkommando. But in Leib Langfuss's notes, he writes about meeting the Bayana Rebbe inside the gas chamber right before he's killed. Now again, I want to remind you, he doesn't look like the Bayana Rebbe right now. He's undressed, first of all. He's with thousands of others. No beard. No anything. But yet he's with his people. Probably family members, some Hasidim, and then whoever else was there on his transport. The train that came with him from Krakow. And he says first to the SS officer who's literally closing the door on them. He says, do you think you'll succeed in destroying the Jewish people? The Jewish people are going to live forever. And then he turns to everyone around him and he says, let's all die as Jews together. Let's say Shema Yisrael. And he leads them all, almost like it's like it's davening mincha in a shul. Let's all say it as a chazan, and in a community we're going to say Shema Yisrael together. And then they're killed. And the one who wrote it and recorded the story is killed. So what was the point of it all? The point of it all is that we should hear the story today. That we should hear the Biyana Rebbe talking to us. That he's telling that SS officer, you think you're going to succeed in destroying the people? If the Biyana Rebbe would come and sit down here for a few minutes, he would say, look, I knew it. I knew it. Look at the Jewish people. They're going to live forever. They heard my message. You guys are all my Hasidim too, because you're listening to my message. And you see how Rebbes walk to their deaths. And therefore, when he's teaching us, is that the way they walk to their deaths is with the Shema Yisrael. So that when someone who lives in a better generation and doesn't have to walk to their deaths, they get to wake up every morning and live their lives as Jews like we do, then he's teaching us that we should live with that Shema Yisrael. Not just to die al Kiddush Hashem, but to live al Kiddush Hashem. Thank you.